I'm Kai, and for the next few minutes, I want you to sit with one number, 10. 10 people walked onto a ship in New York Harbor in November 1872. None of them were ever seen again. Not one body. Not one scrap of wreckage. Not one confirmed sighting, anywhere, ever. And here's the part that actually breaks the story. The ship they were on didn't sink. It didn't burn. It kept sailing, on its own, for at least 10 days, and it was found in good enough condition that a stranger's crew stepped aboard and sailed it straight to port. For 150 years, that gap between the ship is fine and the people are gone has been filled with sea monsters, pirates, and ghosts. But a modern investigation went back to the actual court records, the actual weather data, and the ship's own log, and it found something almost nobody talks about. 2 real scientific explanations, tested independently, decades apart. And only one of them actually matches what was found on board. The other one is almost certainly the version you've heard. A ship with a reputation before it ever met Benjamin Briggs. To understand why this case spiraled the way it did, you have to go back more than a decade before that November voyage to a small shipyard on Nova Scotia's Bay of Fundy, home to some of the most extreme tides on the planet. In 1860, a shipbuilder named Joshua Dewis laid the keel for his very first vessel at a new yard in Spencer's Island. He named her Amazon. She was a modest brigantine, under 200 tons, built by hand with axe and saw because the yard didn't even have a mill yet. Her very first voyage should have been routine. Haul lumber to London. Instead, her captain, a newly married man named Robert McClellan, came down with pneumonia before the ship had even cleared the bay. He was carried ashore, and within days he died in the home of one of the ship's owners. The first thing the Amazon ever delivered, on her maiden voyage, was her own captain's body, brought home to his new widow. It got worse before it got better. The ship ran aground off Nova Scotia. She collided with another vessel in the Strait of Dover, badly enough that the other crew had to be rescued aboard her. She was sold under circumstances a Nova Scotia court later suspected involved outright fraud by one of her captains, wrecked again off Maine, salvaged, auctioned in New York, and finally bought and renamed by an American owner, Mary Celeste. By the time Benjamin Briggs took command in 1872, the ship had already cycled through 6 captains in 11 years and had been so extensively rebuilt. A new deck, new rigging, tonnage nearly increased by half, that some historians argue she was barely the same vessel Dewis had launched. She had, by any sailor's standard, a reputation. Not a curse in any supernatural sense. Just an unusually rough decade for one hull. What happened next would make sure nobody ever remembered her any other way. The ship that shouldn't have been empty. On December 5th, 1872, a British brigantine called the Dei Gratia was working her way across the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. Her captain, David Morehouse, spotted a ship ahead, moving strangely, not holding a steady course, sails half set and flapping loose, some clearly torn. No one answered his signals. No one appeared on deck. As his ship closed the distance, Morehouse read the name on the stern, the Mary Celeste. An American vessel, out of New York, bound for Genoa with 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. A ship that should have already been in Italy. Morehouse sent a small boarding party across. What they found below decks turned a strange sighting into a genuine mystery. The cargo, nearly all 1,700 barrels of it, was still there, largely untouched. 6 months of food and fresh water sat in storage, more than enough for the rest of the voyage. In the captain's cabin, clothes, boots, pipes, and charts were exactly where you'd expect them if their owner planned to be right back. Nothing had been packed. Nothing looked grabbed in a panic. The ship's only lifeboat, a small yawl normally lashed near the stern, was gone, lowered carefully from its davits, with the tackle left neat, not torn away by a wave. 3.5 feet of water sat in the hold, uncomfortable but nowhere near enough to threaten a ship this size. One of the 2 bilge pumps had been partly disassembled. The ship's log carried its last full entry 10 days earlier, near the Azorean island of Santa Maria. After that, nothing but a half-started note on the log slate, the day's rough draft that never made it into the official record. 10 people were simply gone. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 crewmen. No blood, no broken doors. No sign of a struggle anywhere on the ship. Just an empty, functioning vessel and a silence nobody could explain. Why the simple answers don't survive contact with the evidence. The obvious guesses came fast, and each one collapsed the moment someone actually checked it against what was on the ship. Piracy was the first theory anyone reached for. This was still an era of raiders in parts of the Atlantic, and the Mary Celeste was carrying a cargo that could be resold. But pirates who murder an entire crew and then leave 1,600 barrels of valuable alcohol and a captain's personal belongings untouched aren't pirates behaving like any pirates on record. The economics don't work. Mutiny came next. Some writers at the time pointed at the 4 German sailors aboard, noting that none of their personal belongings turned up in their quarters. Suspicious, if you don't ask why. Decades later, a descendant of 2 of those sailors, brothers Volkert and Boy Lorenzen, told researchers the brothers had lost their gear in a separate shipwreck earlier that same year. They had almost nothing with them because they'd already lost everything once. There was no missing trunk. There was no motive. And there was, again, no sign of the violence a mutiny of this kind would leave behind. Insurance fraud was the next guess, that Briggs, or his part owner James Winchester, staged the disappearance for a payout. It falls apart on a single detail nobody can explain around it. Briggs had personally invested his own savings into a share of this ship. His money, his career, and his family's future were tied to that hull surviving the voyage. And if he'd planned to vanish with the insurance money, there's no version of that plan that involves bringing his wife and 2-year-old daughter along and leaving his 7-year-old son safely behind in Massachusetts with his grandmother. People planning to disappear don't leave witnesses who'll spend their whole lives asking what happened to their parents. Then there's the far end of the spectrum. Sea monsters, giant waterspouts, and a short story published in 1884 by a young writer who hadn't invented Sherlock Holmes yet, Arthur Conan Doyle. His tale imagined a vengeful ex-slave sneaking aboard and murdering everyone before rowing away. Doyle wrote it purely as fiction, and even misspelled the ship's name as Mary Celeste. A spelling error that somehow outlived the fact that the whole story was invented, and still shows up in retellings today. None of these survive a close look at the physical evidence. So in the early 2000s, one documentary filmmaker decided to stop treating this like folklore and start treating it like an unsolved case file, what the real investigation actually found. Filmmaker Anne MacGregor spent years on this case for a Smithsonian Channel documentary called The True Story of the Mary Celeste. Instead of starting with theories, she went back to the primary sources, the original Gibraltar court transcripts, the ship's log slate entries, and historical weather records nobody had cross-referenced in this much depth before. She brought in Phil Richardson, a physical oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who specializes in exactly this kind of question. How derelict vessels move once nobody's steering them. Their first task was almost embarrassingly basic, and nobody had actually done it properly. Could an empty Mary Celeste really drift, unmanned, from her last confirmed position near Santa Maria Island to the spot where the Dei Gratia found her, roughly 400 miles and 10 days later? Richardson pulled historical wind and current data for that exact stretch of ocean and time window from the International Comprehensive Ocean Atmosphere Dataset, a database built from more than 2 centuries of marine weather records, mostly used today to study long-term climate patterns. Running the numbers, the answer came back clearly, yes. Under the winds that were actually blowing that week, a ship like the Mary Celeste could have sailed and drifted herself along close to that exact path with nobody at the wheel. That answered how the ship moved. It didn't answer the harder question. Why would an experienced, well-regarded captain order his wife, his toddler, and his entire crew into a small open boat in the middle of the Atlantic, abandoning a ship that, as it turned out, was never actually sinking? This is where MacGregor and Richardson found something that had sat in the record for over a century without anyone connecting the dots. Replotting Briggs's own logged positions against the real weather and current conditions of those final days exposed a navigation error. Briggs believed the ship was near Santa Maria Island days before she actually reached it, off by roughly 120 miles. The likely cause, an inaccurate chronometer, the precision clock every 19th century captain depended on to calculate longitude at sea. He thought land was close. It wasn't, not yet. Now stack a second. Unrelated problem on top of that one. The Mary Celeste had recently carried a cargo of coal, and coal dust and construction debris from a major refit are exactly the kind of thing that clogs a ship's bilge pumps. When the Dei Gratia's crew boarded her, one of the 2 pumps was found partially taken apart. Not necessarily broken beyond use, but out of commission at that moment, possibly mid-repair. With that pump down and the hold packed solid with barrels from floor to ceiling, Briggs had no reliable way to see or measure how much water was actually accumulating beneath his cargo. Put those 2 things together and you get a genuinely dangerous, entirely human situation. A captain who believes he's farther from land than his instincts say he should be after 20 days at sea, sailing through rough weather with a pump he can't trust and no way to check how much water is really in his hull. That is not a man panicking over nothing. That's a captain making the most defensible call available to him with the information he actually had. Get everyone into the lifeboat, stay close to the ship, and wait until it's clear whether she's safe or until land comes into view. The theory almost everyone gets wrong. Here's where most retellings of this story, including some of the most watched documentaries and videos online right now, quietly swap in a different explanation, and it's worth slowing down on exactly why that's a problem. You've probably heard some version where the crew smelled alcohol fumes building up in the cargo hold, feared an imminent explosion, and fled the ship in a panic. It's a vivid image, and to be clear, it isn't invented nonsense. It's a real, older theory, first proposed by one of Briggs's own relatives, a man named Dr. Oliver Cobb, and it comes with its own genuine scientific test behind it. In 2006, a chemist at University College London, Dr. Andrea Sella, built a scale model of the Mary Celeste's cargo hold for a television demonstration. Rather than using real alcohol vapor, he used butane gas, which behaves similarly when mixed with air in an enclosed space. He sealed the model, filled it with gas, and ignited it. What happened wasn't a Hollywood fireball. It was a sudden pressure blast, a fast, forceful rush of flame and pressure up through the open hatch, strong enough to have blown open hatch covers and shaken an entire ship, while leaving little to no visible burn damage behind for anyone inspecting the wreck afterward. That experiment genuinely proved something important. A vapor explosion on a ship like the Mary Celeste could physically happen without leaving the kind of scorch marks a 19th century investigator would know to look for. But here's the detail that almost every retelling leaves out. When MacGregor's team went back and reread the original 1872 boarding report, the actual words the Dei Gratia's crew gave under oath. It specifically noted that the ship's main hatch was found secured, and nobody in the boarding party reported smelling fumes when they came aboard. The one piece of physical evidence you'd expect a vapor incident to leave behind simply isn't in the historical record. So to be precise about this, both explanations rest on real, tested science. Neither one is a myth. They just don't describe the same event, and they can't both be what actually happened. The chronometer and pump theory lines up with what the Dei Gratia's crew documented finding on board. The vapor explosion theory is chemically sound, but it doesn't match the boarding report itself. Almost nobody draws that distinction clearly. We just did. The people, the legend keeps flattening into props. Every version of this story, the sea monsters, the mutiny, the ghosts, buries 10 real people who boarded a ship expecting to come home. Benjamin Briggs came from a long line of sea captains going back generations. People who sailed under him described him as steady, fair, and deeply religious. He reportedly didn't drink, despite commanding a ship loaded with alcohol. Days before departure, in a letter to his mother, he wrote that his vessel was in beautiful trim and that he hoped for a fine passage. Those are the words of a man planning an ordinary crossing, not staging a disappearance. His wife, Sarah, wasn't new to this life either. She'd already made long ocean voyages with Benjamin, including their honeymoon crossing years earlier. She brought their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, along on what was meant to double as a working voyage and a family trip to Italy. Their 7-year-old son, Arthur, stayed home with his grandmother so he wouldn't fall behind in school. In one of her last letters, written from New York before they even set sail, Sarah asked that Arthur be told she was counting on his letters and would try to remember things from the trip he'd enjoy hearing about. That is not something a mother writes if she doesn't expect to see her son again. The crew were experienced, respected sailors, not drifters picked up at the last minute. First mate Albert Richardson had sailed with Briggs before and was personally trusted by him. Second mate Andrew Gilling was in his mid-20s, with family ties in New York. Steward and cook Edward Head was newly married. The 4 remaining sailors, brothers Volkert and Boy Lorenzen, along with Arian Martins and Gottlieb Gudschall, were experienced seamen from the Faroe Islands whom Briggs, in his own words, described as good men, if not the sharpest navigators. None of them fit the profile of people planning a mutiny, a fraud, or a murder. What fits is 10 ordinary people making a defensible decision under real uncertainty, and then losing an unwinnable fight against wind, distance, and cold water that nobody on that ship could have seen coming in time. The ship that outlived them, and the ending nobody saw coming. Here's the part of the story that almost never makes it into retellings, and it deserves to, after the Gibraltar hearing, which, after more than 3 months of digging by Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood, found no proof of foul play at all, though the salvage payment awarded to the Dei Gratia's crew was suspiciously small. The Mary Celeste didn't retire quietly. She went back to work. New owners used her for cargo runs for another 12 years, and her reputation as a haunted or unlucky ship followed her the entire time, making her progressively harder to sell. In 1884, a captain named G.C. Parker, under new ownership, deep in debt, deliberately ran the Mary Celeste onto a reef near Haiti in a staged insurance fraud, having overinsured a cargo that was, in reality, mostly worthless. The scheme fell apart almost immediately once an insurance investigator inspected what the ship had actually been carrying. Parker and his co-conspirators were taken to court and forced to return the fraudulent payout to avoid prosecution. Every man directly responsible for that final, deliberate wreck, the owner, the captain, and the first mate, was dead within 6 months. It's almost certainly coincidence, but it's the kind of detail that, once you know it, is very hard to unknow. The Mary Celeste, the ship at the center of the most famous maritime mystery in history, didn't vanish in some cosmic, unexplainable way. She was deliberately destroyed by a man trying to cheat an insurance company on a reef in broad daylight 12 years after the disappearance that made her famous. Sometimes the ending to a legend is just as human as its beginning. What's still missing? Here's the piece. No oceanographer, no chemist, and no documentary has ever been able to close. Once that lifeboat pulled away from the Mary Celeste side, there is no further record of what happened to the 10 people in it. No wreckage, no bodies. No ship anywhere in that stretch of the North Atlantic ever reported picking up survivors, then or later. The Mary Celeste kept sailing without them, carried by wind and current along close to the exact path the historical weather data says she should have taken, until a stranger's crew found her drifting, empty, and turned her into the story you've heard your whole life. We can now explain, with real data and real named researchers, why 10 people got into a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on a November morning in 1872. We still can't explain what happened to them in the hours or days after that rope went slack or came loose between the yawl and the ship. That gap has been sitting there for 150 years, and there's a real chance it's going to stay there. If you want more of this, legendary mysteries taken apart properly with the actual science instead of the version that just gets repeated, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.